Hello, everyone. Welcome to the June the 4th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk Meeting. My name is Richard Brown. I am the interim governance facilitator. Today, I am joined with LongForWisdom, who is the governance facilitator, the other one in the non-interim form. This is going to be an interesting call. I say that anyways, it's muscle memory at this point. Or it might not be, who knows? We'll see how it goes. We generally have a list of speakers scheduled for these calls, and occasionally the stars align where we do not have a list of people that are joining us to fill us in on some specific aspect of the ecosystem or a new initiative. So today we may just have a quicker call than usual, but what I would like to do is encourage people, maybe implore would be a better word, beg, to use this time to resurrect some of these stale threads that we deal with in these calls. One of the overarching issues with governance in our protocol is that there is no shortage of things to talk about. Quite the opposite. We rarely, at least in my opinion, we're rarely able to identify and pull apart all the threads that we need to, or at least for as long as we probably should. There's just a lot going on. We're at the kind of at the forefront of a brand new space, open source governance, or at least we're farther along in a brand new space than many. And so we're discovering things as we go. That's a lot of work, and frequently things get pushed to the side as new things come along. So what I would love is for everybody in the call today to give some thought to issues or questions or ideas that they've had as regards to the protocol that they feel may not have gotten enough attention or may have been forgotten, or they just have generalized questions about governance and risk. Please take the first part of the call to think about that a bit, make some notes, and then come at us or come at the group with some questions after we get through our regular agenda. And then we can see where that leads us. Or we could, like I said, potentially have an early call today. As far as the agenda goes, we have our regularly scheduled guests joining us. LongForWisdom will be walking us through governance at a glance, and there's a lot of governance to glance at. Charles St. Louis is giving us our weekly MIPs update as we continue to, well, sort of along the same lines as what I was talking about earlier, but as we continue to transition from the old style of managing governance into this new MIPified world. There's going to be some concepts that we all need to grasp at the same time, some understanding of what process actually means to us and how that gets implemented, and some of the bumps in the road we hit along the way. And then LongForWisdom will walk us through the submission review for MIPs that are in the pipeline. And we'll have Vishesh giving us the state of the peg again. So like I said, while we're walking through the orders of business, please give some thoughts to issues that you would like to talk about during the Q&A session. Yeah, I think that potentially we'll just leave that there then. So I'm going to hand it off to you for governance at a glance, and then we'll get the show on the road.
Yep, sounds good. Just put the link in the chat. All right, so yeah, discussion's been a little light this week. We've had a couple of cool threads pop up. Hexanauts or Samim created a post to keep track of the kind of governance meta parameters that we have started using in terms of the base rate and the DSR spread and other things which are not technically protocol parameters, but are still things we vote on, which I think has been beneficial. So let's see. Island hunting suggests some preemptive action to get ahead of the rate changes that will be required to keep DAI at peg as credit becomes more attractive. That attracted a bit of discussion. Other people obviously having differing opinions. And then Seth from SourceCred posted a kickoff post which kind of shows an example of what the weekly posts for source code are going to look like. It gives some idea of what the rewards will look like based on the last week of May, which is outside the trial, but is kind of a good example. In terms of seeking consensus, I think the only one that's of note that's popped up, so the only signal request that's popped up in the last few weeks is changing the monetary policy poll votes to ranked choice, created by Andy McCall. That was on chain up until a moment ago. I haven't actually checked the outcome. I'm assuming it passed, perhaps dangerously. If anyone knows, feel free to interrupt.
Yeah, it looks like it passed overwhelmingly. So congratulations, Andy, for that. Community thanks you, and the governance facilitators thank you as well. That significantly reduced our workload. So thanks, man.
Cool. And then a couple of other things, actually, which one other thing I wanted to mention is that Tim Black posted a kind of Google form, like research form thing for the governance communications team, asking for input as to what the kind of things the communications team should produce, and also sort of looking to see if anyone is interested in taking part in that team. So I will share that link as well. I think that's the extent of governance at a glance there.
All right, since we are sort of, dare I say, starved for content today, and Tim is in the call, I wonder if I should force you into the spotlight. Tim, feel free to decline, or I can just speak to this issue. So the PR governance team in general is a fascinating initiative, and I encourage people to take a look at this, because traditionally in this space, we troll for talent. We try to get them engaged in the protocol and the ecosystem, and then we provide funding to get them to do work. The subtext there is 99% of the time that's somehow related to purely technical activities. Admittedly, there's lots of content generation, but that leaves a fairly significant hole in our ecosystem. And one of those holes is, how does a DAO, this loose collective of people that share this mission, how do they identify things that they want to communicate, and how do they go about communicating them? Sounds simple, but it's not. It's fascinatingly complex, complicated. I don't know. It's worth thinking about. So we have the foundation. The foundation has bright lines drawn around it. And then we have people in this call, people in our chats, people in the governance ecosystem. We have maker voters. We have this collection of delightful circles in this gigantic Venn diagram. And there's issues that the DAO needs to communicate externally, but we don't really have a mechanism for community-sourced or community-directed messaging, I guess. And so the question is, how do you do something like that? How does a group of people arise that is capable of determining what a voice is, what the messages are, what channels should be pursued to communicate those messages, how does it get feedback? These are all very, very interesting questions. And it's something that I personally believe that we all desperately need, is some framework where the community can get together and speak to the larger community, or to speak to the world at large, with sort of one voice, or maybe a limited number of voices, who knows, but in some kind of cohesive manner. And so that's what this communications team seeks to do. So if you have chops in areas that are frequently ignored by the crypto space, like marketing, content generation, communication, project management, all these other dark arts that I barely comprehend myself, we are desperately looking for talent. So please hit up that thread and talk to Tim if you feel like there's something you can bring to the table here. Tim, did you?
Yeah, I just
ready for the spotlight?
Come out of the dark of taking notes about the thing that I'm doing, which is quite a recursive notion. But yeah, so that's a perfect summary. Obviously can't have said it better myself. That forum has gotten some good responses from people who are very active on the forums, which is pretty exciting. I'm going to start broadcasting it to other channels, but if you have any feedback about how you think a community should come out and communicate to itself, to the greater public, and then pull in from the greater public back to the DAO itself. That would be super helpful. As Rich said, it's pretty complicated. The one thing I wanted to add is we're trying to recruit more people, and that that gets a lot easier. It gets a lot easier to produce more communications when there are more people that are there. And we do have a Rocket Chat going that's like semi-private, but it's by no means exclusive. So it's a fully open call and it's welcome to people. We normally meet Thursdays in the afternoon PST, but we're flexible as well. So yeah, we have somebody from Taiwan who's in there. So that's all I wanted to say.
Eric, thanks for that, Tim. So yeah, TLDR, the DAO needs a voice. Community needs a voice, or a series of voices, or it needs to coordinate around a voice. So if you think you have that kind of a skill set, please reach out. There's a lot of really interesting things to do, and it would be nice to facilitate some non-development work for once. All right, so back to the agenda. Let's move on to This Week in MIPS, Charles, if you wanted to get us kicked off.
Yeah, for sure. So this month is a lot busier in terms of MIPS than last month. Last month we saw one sub-proposal go through the entire process successfully, which is a really great way to test the entire process. As for this month, I mean, the second governance cycle began on June 1st. The formal submission period for June's governance cycle was from June 1st to June 3rd. And this period is when MIPS and sub-proposals are proposed to enter the governance cycle and wait for the approval from the governance facilitators to formally enter it in the next week. So this month we had 9 proposals that were requesting to enter the governance cycle. The proposals themselves were MIP 13, the declarations of intent, MIP 14, protocol dye transfer, authored both by LongForWisdom. And then we had 4 amendment MIPs go in to improve the MIP 6, MIP 8, MIP 9, and MIP 12 for clarity and just making the general collateral onboarding process more efficient. There was also a sub-proposal to add a risk domain team, which was proposed by Cyrus. Maybe he can speak to that later in the call. And then the last 2 ones were for collateral onboarding. So there were 2 proposals for onboarding KNC and ZRX. And you can see all of the proposal details in this link. Just post it. Oh, maybe someone else, I'll post it after I do the bit, but it will link to all the proposals and the details around them from the forum post to the GitHub. Oh, there we go. So today, the governance facilitators will do the review of these 9 proposals and go over whether they should be included in the inclusion polls that are going to go out next Monday. So next Monday, there's going to be the inclusion polls for the ones that have been approved, which would be put out to determine whether they should proceed through the governance process and be put into governance polls in week 3 and so on. And just to reiterate, the inclusion polls occur when MKR holders decide what they want to bundle together into the future governance polls. They also serve as this threshold to necessitate the attention of a governance poll. As I mentioned in previous calls or forum posts, there's an inclusion threshold that needs to be met for it to formally move on, and that is 3,000 MKR. So the yes votes have to be greater than the threshold that I just mentioned, and the no votes for it to be approved. So each poll will have a yes and no option. And once the polls end on Thursday before the governance call next week, there will be a review of these results and to basically decide whether which proposals have made it that far, and will proceed to the governance poll in the next week. So in terms of collateral onboarding updates, the exec passed today for TUSD and USDCB to add them both to the Maker protocol. And once the pause has passed, I think around 1917 UTC, they'll officially be added to the Maker protocol, which is exciting. In terms of the community greenlight polls, they're still in progress over the next 4 days. So don't forget to vote on the collateral types that you align with and want to see move forward. And as a general reminder, the community Greenlight polls scores provide a reasonable approximation for which assets the community support and which ones the domain team should prioritize and consider. But it is not binding to the domain teams, and the domain teams ultimately make the decision on which collateral types they want to domain greenlight and then work on the domain work for. So that's it for the MIPS update today. I will post another forum post in the MakerDAO forums highlighting everything I've just said, and it's open for discussion there, of course.
All right.
All right. Thanks, Charles. Long, do you want to take us through the next step?
Yeah, you're gonna have to do some of them because I wrote them. It becomes a little
Yeah,
bit
I'll
difficult
follow
if
on afterwards.
I do those ones. Cool. Okay, so as Charles just said, there are 9 MIPs / sub-proposals that are going into the June, or that are submitted for the June cycle. This is MIP 13, MIP 14, amendments to MIP 6, MIP 8, MIP 8, MIP 9, MIP 12, a sub-proposal to add Cyrus as a risk domain team, and 2 MIP 12 sub-proposals to onboard KNC and ZRX. Right, so I guess starting with the amendments, skipping my stuff for the time being. So the amendments to MIP 6, 8, 9, and 12 all seem fine in terms of formatting and presentation. I would encourage people to at the very least read over the amendment text as it gives a brief overview of what's changing. And if you have a bit of extra time, to look at the PR to actually sort of see the details of what's changing. In general, these are kind of intended as sort of clarity updates, but there are some sort of minor changes in how things work in those. The kind of semi-major change within those amendments is that the ordering of domain greenlight and community greenlight is being switched. So once these pass, we'll have community greenlight polls happen before domain greenlight provided by the domain teams. Just in terms, because that makes it easier for the domain teams to sort of prioritize what they're working on, or prioritize the greenlight process. Cyrus's proposal to add a risk domain team also seems fine. Feel a little sparse. Everyone kind of knows who Cyrus is, though, so writing a whole essay about who he is and why he wants to be a risk domain team would be also kind of a waste of time. Cyrus, do you want to talk briefly about your proposal? To say really, but...
Sure. I don't really know what to say, but is there anything in particular? I mean, it's just kind of in line with the other domain team proposals.
Cool.
I don't actually think I have much to add, to be honest.
Fair enough. All right. Well, hopefully everyone will consider voting for that. So the 2 MIP 12 sub-proposals, there was some sort of irregularities with, I guess I should say. These were technically submitted after the submission window due to like a minor technicality. Since this is since we're still getting started with the governance cycle, that doesn't seem like a reasonable, justification for not considering them submitted to this governance cycle. That said, there was some confusion about the requirements for domain work presented in those sub-proposals. As MIP 12 is written, it's kind of assumed that kind of complete domain work would be presented for each domain, which is kind of not present. So I think we're leaning towards declining these sub-proposals as part of the MIPS process, and instead doing them as part of the weekly cycle until we can kind of tidy up the MIPS process and figure out exactly what needs to be produced and present in those sub-proposals. Rich or Charles, did you want to comment on this as well at all?
Well, I can, maybe it's something we could break off into the Q&A session, possibly
Sure.
in the absence of other people having threads that they want to talk about. Process is something I can talk about for hours. So maybe we can talk about workflows versus process, or letter of the law versus expediency. There's larger issues that need to be understood. I think that we're going to be butting up against this in the MIPS process. Maybe I'm a bit more conservative when it comes to these things than others because I've been scarred in numerous wars. I think that the MIPS process is going to take us months to fully onboard completely. So I'm not terribly concerned about this, but we can talk about it a bit more in the Q&A session.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in talking more about how we can further improve like the MIP-12 process during the discussion period. And I do definitely think it makes sense to push it more towards the weekly cycle and take some extra steps to ensure that we can better prepare the monthly cycle for July, or that in terms of getting collateral added. So really looking forward to having the open discussion about that.
Yep. Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, to be clear, like no one's like at fault for like this right at this stage. It's just kind of growing pains in terms of the MIPS process. Cool. So, Rich, did you want to discuss the last two MIPs that I wrote?
Yep.
And therefore I'm speaking about?
I've talked about these two MIPs in previous calls, and they're sort of, I don't know, let's call them sleeper MIPs. They seem innocuous on the surface. Yeah, actually, let's just start off with this. I have concerns about these MIPs, LongForWisdom. So these two MIPs are necessary, I believe. They are potentially extremely powerful, and that's a good thing and that's a bad thing. Like I said the last time I brought this issue up, I really encourage the community to have a look at these two proposals because they represent a fundamental shift. Let me post the links in the way that this community will work. And the way that it does that is it formally allows a way, MIPS 13 allows for community members to, well, it's in the name, a declaration of intent. So it allows the community to decide that they want to do something, formally state that they have that intention, come up with some planning around how these things could possibly happen. We have mechanisms that, informal mechanisms or slightly formal or whatever cultural norms, where we've been doing that for a while now, a long time. That's how governance has moved along. There's a significant missing piece of that puzzle though, because as long as the foundation controls the purse strings, there is, what's that?
I should maybe just interrupt at this point. I, like about a week ago, I edited this MIP to remove the bounty sections because a number of people were concerned about them. Yeah, so just wanted to make it clear that the MIP 13 doesn't actually allow any money to change hands. So this is like in its current iteration.
Sorry, I might be blurring both of them together in my excitement about the conceptual importance of these things. And so the DAO needs to have agency and sovereignty. So the community needs to be able to determine that something needs to happen, and then it needs to be able to make a thing happen. There's nothing stopping that from happening now, other than you know, the time and effort required to do that. But there is a significant number of tasks that need to be paid for, because you get what you pay for in this world. And when you want high quality work, you want people to devote great deal of time and energy to doing something, you need to have a mechanism for which they can be compensated. And that is the transition into MIP 14, which it says it's a generic process for transferring DAI from the protocol into a specific wallet. And that's, for anybody who's been paying attention to this, our protocol and the ecosystem in general, should fill you with absolute terror. But the protocol has checks and balances in place. It has circuit breakers. It has governance delays. It has a significant barrier to entry in getting executives passed. So there's all kinds of checks and balances here. But ultimately, this is a very powerful mechanism that allows the community to decide that it wants to do something, and then acquiring the financial resources to get that thing done. This changes everything, basically, in my opinion. It's necessary. It's super important. It requires a great deal of thought and care in its implementation, but ultimately I find nothing wrong with the two proposals. And so they will be added to the inclusion pool. My request here, though, is that the community dig into these two threads and give them a great deal of thought, because these are going to be some of the, like I said, the most powerful tools that the community is going to have in its arsenal, tools at its disposal. And so there needs to be some thought here. So anyways, long-winded, of course, but that's MIP 13 and MIP 14. Please have a look at them, and do some conceptual, or get a conceptual understanding of what they imply for the community and the ecosystem, and look forward to being able to vote on them soon.
Cool. All right. I think that covers all the submitted MIPs for June. So someone's going to clarify, everything will be moving to inclusion polls with the exception of the two MIP 12 sub-proposals, which will continue through the weekly governance cycle instead.
All right, cool. It still feels like we should have a gavel or something, but in the absence of that, let's just move on. So here's where we have this fork in the road. No specific speakers available to us today, and I begged and pleaded and exhorted for people to come up with questions about threads that they have, they want to talk about, or ancient thoughts or topics that they want to go over. So we can either dig into those now if there's this overwhelming desire to do so. It occurs to me, though, that for some reason, this is another cultural norm, we just wait till the very last possible minute and give Vishesh some time to shine. And maybe that could potentially be backwards at this point. So I'm not seeing anybody asking any questions in the sidebar or raising any hands.
I just want to make one quick point. I just want to highlight that we posted 2 collateral evaluations last night in the forums. I know they were briefly mentioned earlier as part of MIP 12, but just want to make sure that people get some eyes on this, and then please read through, and happy to discuss in the forums or maybe in one of the coming governance calls. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, we may be good to
Cool.
do sort of brief presentations, I guess, on them, or just sort of one of you guys talking through them or something, Cyrus.
Yeah, unfortunately, we can't do that today because we don't have enough.
That's fine.
Yeah, but sure.
Cool.
LongForWisdom, we're soulmates. I was about to say exactly the same thing. I was going to try and force Cyrus to do it today, though. So you're obviously a lighter touch than I.
Actually, this may be a good time to talk about the whole agenda stuff for governance calls going forwards.
Sure. I was just trying to figure out or continue or finish the thought about whether Vishesh wants to go first and not just like sit around until we're bored, or whether we should do the Q&A session. Vishesh, are you?
Yeah, I'm happy to share stuff now.
All right. Yeah. Why don't we do that, and then we'll get into some meta issues after you're done.
Okay. I believe I need permission to do so.
Yes, you do. It's the world we live in. There you go.
All right. So, at a glance, what's going on lately with DAI, at least, it's pretty close to the peg. It's been trading pretty close to the peg for the last week or so. We even had a slight dip below the peg, so that I think is a positive indicator, especially given the fact that the ETH price has been sort of continuing to rise. So it appears there's an increased appetite for leverage, which, as we know, that tends to help bring down the DAI peg. Though it's not dipping sustainably like below $1, which is interesting to compare to, say, previous, I'm not going to label anything a bull run, but previous upturns for extended periods of time, where essentially in those times, the primary concern was not DAI staying above peg for too long of a period, but rather DAI dipping below the peg and staying down there. So it seems similar scenario, completely different result, which means, you know, either people's general perception of how the system should work has changed, or the fundamental economics have changed. It's probably the former. That's pretty inseparable from the latter as well. So it's almost like DAI has gone through 3 cycles. The first, you know, way back when DAI was would dip below the peg, and then there was kind of this hesitancy to arbitrage, and so it would stay below the peg. Then there was a time period where, you know, through community effort, generating more demand, adjusting monetary policy levers, etc., you know, the community was able to recover DAI to return above peg. After that point, it seemed that you know, DAI arbitrage use cases were, people were much more confident in them, and so, you know, they were much easier. Since then, it's almost, you know, like the community is too ready to arbitrage DAI, and hesitant actually to let it go and sell it. Though now it seems that DAI has come back down to peg from that situation. So DAI's kind of gone through a bit of an evolution there. But it seems, at least for now, that DAI is functioning back to like a new normal, let's say, where in the old normal, hovering at peg meant hovering slightly below more often than not. But the new normal appears to be that when it's quote unquote at peg, it's hovering very slightly above. So, you know, status quo appears to be where we're at right now. If we look back at the last 30 days or so, essentially it had, you know, after coming back down from the extreme above peg case, it was still hovering what was a little higher than people's comfort zone, like $1.01. But then it fluctuated a bit. It dipped below very, very briefly. Obviously, this line will be exaggerated because it's just a simple volume weighted average price, and then basically come right back to about as close to peg as you can expect it to be. So that all seems good. It will be interesting to watch what happens to ETH next, because ETH tends to whiplash a little bit. So if it does come back down suddenly, that may distress the situation again, but we'll just have to sort of play that by ear. So as far as what's happening under the hood with DAI supply up to 132 million. So 119.8 of that from ETH, with a debt ceiling of 120 million. Crazy utilization. I'm sure people have been made aware of this situation, but that is very, very suddenly hit the cap. And we'll talk a little bit about why that happened. But, you know, obviously there's a discussion that needs to be had about what sense does it make in raising debt ceilings at very low stability fees? Because, you know, if there is free money in the system, do you necessarily want to be continually raising that debt ceiling? Probably not. And it seems that, you know, if you look at this from a pure quantitative standpoint, it makes no sense to currently have these stability fees at 0. Obviously, that move is done for very different reasons, and to handle, you know, distressed situations. So there's a discussion to be had about what cart do you start driving right now? Do you drive the sort of perception psychological cart of trying to restore confidence in the system, though it seems to be working, you know, primarily fine right now? or do you sort of focus on where are you extending risk for those that are holding capital for the system, and for those that have invested in the system? It seems right now that having those stability fees at zero sort of will cause you to max out that debt ceiling again if it were to be raised. So that's just something to be aware of. But we'll go a little bit more into why that happened. So WBTC real quick, just to hit the other collaterals. Since that was added, we saw, a few big jumps in the amount that was minted. That's been sort of sitting at around 9.5 million. The latest number is 9.95, so a few more were minted in the last few days. And this graph's going to be a couple days out of date. Just bring this one back a couple. Okay. For USDC, so that had sort of initially been utilized heavily, and then it was coming down sort of naturally over time. Interesting to note that it was coming down after the stability fee was no longer zero, and it just seems that there's not a huge use case for it at the moment. So that demand has been lower, and the amount issued has been coming down. The latest DAI from USDC is 1.2 million. So even since the most recent value shown here, it's come down significantly more. BAT, has just sort of, it dropped off a bit around March, and then it's just sort of been floating around that 500,000 mark. The latest value is 594, so it came up very, very slightly since what's shown here, but more or less just kind of been sitting flat. ETH. Okay, so ETH is an interesting one right now because what we just talked about. So obviously it was long-term trend rising. All that stuff in March happened. There was a big drop off, and then it sort of resumed its rising trend. That number, so this was on the 28th, it was 107, but since then it's shot up to 119. So you can sort of see that shown here is that value has jumped up since the 28th. It sort of shot up, dipped a little, shot up again. There were a couple of notable transactions to touch on here. So this is one particular vault that had minted 10 million DAI all at once. And this was minted and then effectively dumped onto Compound. So you can see here that they supplied 10 million DAI to Compound for CDAI, and are currently earning a 0.3% free rate on that effectively, because there is technically an arbitrage right now between the stability fee on Maker and the supply rate on Compound, and we know what happens in those instances. This was sort of predictable in that sense, and when those opportunities exist at such a low cost, you have to expect people to max out the debt ceiling, and I think raising it, even in the past, but in the future, raising it needs to come with a discussion of, okay, what is the likelihood that someone's going to use this for a flash transaction or a free arbitrage opportunity, and not necessarily to generate leverage for themselves, but rather to quickly source capital to take advantage of another opportunity. So yeah, I think there's definitely a discussion that needs to be had there about the stability fees. Just to touch on collateral real quick. So, everything more or less status quo. The mints from this vault are sitting around the 250 mark, which kind of falls more or less into one of these trimodal peaks. But one of the interesting things to note is there's a slight uptick in the amount of DAI issued from ETH at a low collateralization ratio. So this is a bit more than it usually is, and we can sort of go through some of these vaults and see that there's you know, a few large positions, like say 350,000 here, that are sitting at, you know, like 210 collateralization ratio. So comparatively low. So that's just something to be aware of as well. Okay, I don't want to belabor it, but I can double click on anything that people want to see. I didn't actually see how long I was talking for.
Just one point I want to make about the 10 million mint. Was there some discussion in various forums that the mint was potentially for the comp token allocation mechanism?
Do we know what the latest word is on the mechanism for distribution there? Is it going to be based off outstanding borrow or lifetime borrow interest? Because that's a variable that Compound tracks as well, which is not something that people would benefit from like just taking a flash amount of capital and depositing it.
I wouldn't know the answer to that question, but I think somebody on this call might.
Earned only on interest going forward.
Yeah, and it deposits per block.
Okay.
And it's split 50-50 between suppliers and borrowers.
Got it. So not a huge opportunity there, but still something that someone could be taking advantage of for a very low cost. Right? Because if it's a very low supply rate, then, you know, 0.38, if it's based off of the supply interest earned and borrow interest paid, then 0.38% on 10 million is not a huge amount, but it's not negligible for sure. I mean, I don't know if other people who've been tracking the Compound side of things more closely have comments on that, but that seems to be a potential viable explanation. Okay. Yeah, again, happy to answer any questions, or we can pass it off to the next section. I don't see any questions in the chat.
Yeah, we can move on. That's fine.
Thank you.
Cool.
Right, thanks,
Right.
Vishesh. That was awesome as usual. Long, actually, do you want to? Are you going to MC now? What do we do next?
I was going to just talk about the agendas for these meetings going forwards
Nice.
briefly.
Yeah. Let's do it.
So, as part of the governance facilitator mandate, there is a intention to set the agendas for these meetings, or at least to like make public the agendas for these meetings like a week in advance. So going forward, I think we're going to be posting the meeting agenda like at the end of the meeting for next week's meeting, and we'll add in the sections that we like are fairly confident are going to happen. If anybody has something that they want to present, then they can either message one of us or post in the thread and say what they want to do. But that just means kind of everyone has a better idea of what's coming and whether they would want to come to the meeting, especially for people with limited time and who aren't sure what's gonna come up. Obviously, if there's anything like incredibly urgent, then we can change it last minute. But the idea is to provide as much notice as possible.
All right, thanks, Long. Yes, so actually, I'm not going to recap. That's fairly straightforward. So, as promised, we have now entered the Q&A aspect, or section of the call. And I'm sure we have a laundry list of important issues that everybody's been furiously writing notes about so that we can get into. Who wants to go first? So if anybody has a question that they don't have access to a microphone. Oh, who's this? Sorry, I missed that. Was somebody speak?
Does anyone want to talk about WBTC debt ceiling?
I would love to. Lev, I can barely hear you though. Maybe it's
Yeah,
just
could
me.
you mic up, please?
I'll try again. Does anyone want to talk about WBTC debt ceiling? And can you guys hear me okay?
Yes and yes. Why don't you get us kicked off, Lev? Do you have some thoughts about the debt ceiling you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think you know, we've obviously there when WBTC was being added, I think there was some it wasn't clear basically, you know, if we would actually see that much utilization up front, which is why kind of arguing about where exactly the debt ceiling should be seemed like kind of like a not the most relevant point. But now that we've seen this used to basically 100%, I think it's interesting to discuss this and also to discuss the risk parameters broadly, the risk factors for WBTC, just the general schedule of scaling WBTC in Maker, you know, increased decentralization of WBTC. Some of these topics are better addressed in the forum, but I wanted to kind of highlight here that these are some things that I think are interesting. And in particular, you know, as we hike the ETH debt ceiling, or depending on what the polls say, but it's this seems to be the we might be back into that rhythm again. It's worth thinking about whether the WBTC debt ceiling should be kind of proportionately hiked up to a certain point, and what the community sentiment on that is.
So my initial thoughts on that was, personally, I think it'd be nice to see demand for it outside of the zero rate environment or the 1%, whatever. Because essentially right now it's like subsidizing a huge carry trade, right? And if rates were to normalize back up, would we still see the same amount of demand? And at this point, is that such a good idea in your mind to just raise it if we're just basically subsidizing it for, you know, a large, you know, secondary lending platform to just take advantage in that way? Like, does that benefit really outweigh the risks? At least with ETH, you don't have to worry. I mean, the same thing's happening with ETH, but at least you don't have to reason about the counterparty risk or the centralization risk there. So if the goal was just to get the DAI peg in line, at least to me, it just feels safer to just kind of keep ratcheting up the ETH debt ceiling.
Yeah, I think I didn't mean to suggest that I was of the opinion that we should be blindly ratcheting up the WBTC ceiling. I think that there's, yeah, I think you mentioned obviously, and I hinted at this earlier, that I think that there's some sort of limit related to counterparty risk, at which point most people would not be comfortable increasing it. For ETH, there's actually a similar, at least for me, limit, which is that at some point, if you have too much issued against ETH liquidity starts to become a serious problem. I don't think we know where exactly that level is, or at least as a community, I don't think we've come to consensus on like what is the hard limit for ETH debt ceiling. But as a guess, I would say somewhere between 100 million and a billion is where you are going to start to see serious problems with liquidating. Like, you know, a Black Thursday scenario would be bad, not only from, you know, with the kind of stuff that we had with auctions, but actually bad from an ETH liquidity point of view, right? And you see this with BitMEX all the time. So there was a crazy BitMEX liquidation already this week, which you know, these things happen quite a lot. And basically, there is also some level with ETH that we have to worry about. The nice thing about BTC, of course, is that there's extra liquidity there. So I think. I would be nice to see it, just because I think like when this was initially added, we didn't necessarily discuss in that much detail what the appropriate debt ceiling limit is. You know, I don't think it made sense to argue about it too much, given that we didn't even know whether, like, you know, whether even, you know, 2 million DAI would be issued against it.
Yeah, those are all valid points. In terms of liquidity, I mean, one point I want to make is that I think that DAI liquidity, like, as the debt ceilings or as the supply outstanding increases, I think before we hit the constraint of the collateral assets liquidity on the exchanges, I think we hit upon the keepers DAI liquidity constraints first, right? Keepers run out of DAI before the markets run out of asset liquidity, I think. And so given that ETH and wrap Bitcoin are pretty much correlated, at least on the huge downturns, whichever one crashes or whichever one has the DAI outstanding, the keepers are going to be constrained one way or another. So I think from that perspective, I would guess that it's pretty, like you're not going to get major benefit one way or the other. And then, so that's why I was just saying, like, for me, it's just more a question of the counterparty risk of how the community wants to deal with wrap Bitcoin or any other centralized asset versus, looking at Bitcoin and saying Bitcoin is like some small percentage more liquid than ETH is.
I had 2 points there to what you said. I think, firstly, I'm not sure I completely, or at least I don't straightforwardly agree with what you said about DAI liquidity. I agree that DAI liquidity is extremely important for downside like liquidation risk. However, I'm not sure that DAI liquidity gives you a straightforward cap on the debt ceiling of a collateral asset, because as you grow the debt ceiling, you have more DAI issued, and then you expect to see more keeper DAI inventory, right? So like, if you just, as a thought experiment, if we set the ETH debt ceiling to 10 times where it is now, at 1.2 billion or something like that, and let's say we actually reach that, then I would expect to see approximate, or just vaguely speaking, like 10 times as much DAI available for with keepers or for keepers, right? Because we're actually issuing this DAI by increasing the debt ceiling. So it's not like there's just some, it's not like they're not going to, there's no reason inherently why they wouldn't keep up with the increased issuance. You're just growing the whole market kind of maybe proportionally. So do you see what I mean?
Yeah, but I get you saying, but I think I don't think that, or I think I may have misspoke. So if you think, like, let's say you want to put 50 million debt ceiling between ETH and Bitcoin, given that they'll both crash at the same time, the keepers will still have the same DAI constraint. And even if you 10x it to 500 million, even if it does scale, you still have like the same constraint, right? So my point was more that when choosing to allocate between ETH and Bitcoin, if you assume that they'll be part of the same class, then the way you'd want to mix them wouldn't necessarily be based on Bitcoin's liquidity versus ETH. Potentially, I'm not saying this is like 100%, but I'm just saying, like, potentially there are other bigger concerns. I think what you were saying was that
the way you just put it, I agree with it completely. The way you just put it. So like, there, basically what you're saying is that we're exposed to this factor, which is like
right, crypto, right,
large cap crypto, or like BTC/ETH, right? And then most of the risk is coming from that, right? And that we would stress DAI liquidity at the same time for those. And I completely agree. And that's like obviously the main problem with these correlated assets. And then indeed, you are looking at it more in terms of, do we want to split this exposure, this maximum exposure to this factor between BTC and ETH? From a pure like liquidity point of view of the underlying asset, I think obviously BTC has more liquidity, but you are introducing this this counterparty risk. So that is yeah, right. I completely agree with you there.
Yeah. So my whole question is, is that trade-off worth it? Do we want what is potentially marginal extra liquidity for unquantifiable counterparty risk? And maybe we do. I mean, that's totally fine. I think that's a conversation that needs to be had, or needs to have been had for a while now. But I just don't think it's like, I just think that discussion has to happen first before we do like a proportional raise across ETH and wrap Bitcoin. That's all.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
A couple of sidebar questions, if you guys want to cover them. Sam asked about who's using WBTC, or like Nexo is using a large chunk, and what are they using it for? just on the call. It's this rate arbitrage of some sort, right?
Is that a question or is that is that a statement?
There's a question. Yeah, like
Oh.
what are Nexo using it for, basically?
Yeah, I mean the best I know is from what Primoz was talking about in the forums a few weeks ago about rate arbitrage.
Okay.
Oh no, Lev has to jump off. So.
Seconds, but they're taking in actual BTC and offering DAI in exchange, and they're getting that DAI from the Maker protocol at a cheaper rate, essentially. So, correct.
I believe that's the case. Also, I think, isn't their rate like 5 or 6%, somewhere in that range right now?
Yeah, I'm not sure of what it is, but yeah, like higher than our rate, right? Or the Maker's rate. Cool. And then, like, I guess follow-up question was kind of, will we expect? I mean, we would expect Nexo to repay that presumably as soon as the rates go above that level.
Right, above some threshold. And then, so
yeah.
My idea was, let's maybe wait for that and see what the kind of the more organic demand for wrapped Bitcoin is before we start fiddling around with debt ceilings.
Right. Chris, did you want to make your point quickly about upping the risk premium along with?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking if we were going to increase the debt ceiling, that we should do it in lockstep with some sort of function of rate increase as well. I don't know, this is just an order of operations. Maybe we want to put like a 25 basis point change, in for a risk premium on WBTC now, so that we're at least being compensated for the risk. But if we were going to continue to up it, which could in theory bring, more diversity to people taking advantage of that offering, we may want to, say for every million we do, go by 25 basis points, some function like that. Which, if they're willing to go all the way up to 6%, that would be what, like, be 1% per 4 million to be like 24 million or something. I don't know. Additional debt ceiling at some point, and then we also get that on the lower 10 million that's already out there. So I don't know. I mean, I made that up literally right now. So maybe we should discuss some sort of debt ceiling goes up with the risk premium, because we have to be compensated for the counterparty risk with WBTC.
Yeah, seems like a good point, right? Like the
but just one more comment about wrap BTC is just that it's not like a static thing, right? Like it's like there is, there's a lot of discussions, happening right now about, making it much more robust and, by adding more people to kind of, help out with the wrap BTC DAO, and this is just something that we should just consider too when discussing, how we're managing wrap BTC.
I mean, does anyone have any idea what, how high? I mean, I'm sure they don't really want to tell us, but how high Nexo would be willing to go for this rate arbitrage?
It's a marketplace. Just like, I think it's somewhat unfair to judge the outcome of something just because someone has found some clever way to kind of make a market more efficient. I don't think it's we should poo-poo necessarily anyone who's just kind of speculating on a different aspect of DeFi, right? I mean, some people really like speculating on ETH and they open up a CDP and they're long ETH. Some people just see an opportunity and just there's a tool that they can use. Again, we're not, we're competing against other projects, whole other blockchains, all this stuff. So I just think that the community should just be cognizant of that and just try to.
Yeah, I agree completely with that. I don't think anyone is trying to or shouldn't be like trying to penalize specific actors, right?
Sure, sure,
We,
sure.
Oh yeah, if what I said came off as that's not what I'm saying at all. Our problem is that we have what, like 25 or 2600 wrapped BTC in our system that presumably has a similar liquidation point and would be nearly impossible to clear if we hit liquidation on that, which means that, you know, at very least we need to be building up the surplus buffer in order to, you know, possibly handle a liquidation of that asset. And maker holders should be compensated for some amount of risk. I'm happy. I think it's great. We found a good we found a user that really wants to use the service. That's awesome. But you know, we probably should be compensated for the risks that the protocol is taking.
For absolutely, and I definitely think you know,
I think it's the fact that it's such a large chunk. I think, isn't it, right? Like that it's not necessarily bad, but it's like something we need to pay attention to, right?
Of course, yeah, for sure. But I think that then we all kind of generally agree then, like, that we should raise rates on wrap BTC and kind of see what.
Yeah, I mean, again, people here may agree. This is like, you know, we have to, you know, governance comes through the forums and things, right? So
Yeah, of course.
signal requests, etc., etc.
I mean, I think we should sort of approach this from what's the core mandate of the DAO, which is to maintain stability of the DAI peg and grow the DAI market cap while managing risk in that process. I mean, would anybody disagree with that fundamental perspective?
I'd say that all kind of flows from maker holders wanting to make money, but yes.
And so, you know, if we're trying to achieve those things, you know, the question should be, how do we balance the risk versus reward of potentially upping the WBTC debt ceiling, and what do the rates need to be to balance that risk reward equation? And I like Chris's proposal of, because in some sense risk is increasing with not necessarily debt ceiling, but debt ceiling utilization. So this idea of, you know, so long as, you know, modulo the DAI peg holding stable, you know, sort of turning up the debt ceiling and the rate sort of in concert, or which is more precisely, you're turning up the rate in response to the previous debt ceiling increase getting utilized. Because I feel like there's a general sense that we're probably, our rates are maybe, and you know, this is just my perception, is that maybe our rates are a little low given the centralization and counterparty risk of WBTC. And so we probably like, in principle, to raise rates, but, you know, just in a way that doesn't jeopardize DAI peg.
Raise them nice and easy, you know, just real slow.
Yeah, and more generally, actually, I think all the risk premiums are probably lower than what the actual numbers are. I was wondering, when do people really want to start thinking about actually setting these to what the actual numbers are? Like for ETH, for example, it's obviously not 0% risk. So that number is something greater, and when should we think about sort of setting it to what it actually is as determined by the risk teams?
I mean, should be moved as much as possible while the DAI price is still healthy, right? So I don't think we've quite broken through the wall of buy side liquidity for DAI. I think once that happens, then you start moving rates up to their more targeted risk premiums.
Right. Yeah, okay, that makes sense to me. So just kind of wait until it starts going up so that we don't like have these jerk things like if we up FA to say 5% because that's what the risk premium is and the base rate
No, I
doesn't
don't.
come down to counter it. You don't want to see a sudden outflow of CDP users.
Yeah, I don't think you would kind of make that jump all at once. That would probably cause a little bit of chaos. I think you would have to still gradually do it.
Okay. What about determining these numbers in the first place? Because I'm still in the dark as to what even a reasonable ballpark is.
Well, we actually quoted in the KNC and 0x reports, we quoted the numbers as specifically as risk premiums and not as what the stability fee might be. So the stability fee could differ from the numbers we proposed for the DIPEC, for example. You can check out our methodology in the forum post, and then we can kind of discuss it and see what it would look like for other assets as well.
Yeah, that's great. In particular, I'm most interested in FA because it's the biggest.
Yep. Yeah, we can. I definitely think it's easier to kind of run through on the forums and stuff on chat.
Sweet.
All right, I just started the awkward silence countdown clock. Do we have any other questions in the sidebar that didn't get addressed that people wanted to bite into?
We covered most of them. Do you want to discuss process briefly, or try and start a conversation about process?
Well, yeah, it seems like it's, I don't know, I'm undecided. So here's, if I wanted to dig into a theme and I was adequately prepared, this is the theme that it would be, is that it ties into what I actually sort of obliquely and directly talk about at the top of all of these calls, is that we have a complicated ecosystem, we have a lot of things to do, we have coordination issues, we have largely amorphous group of people that we call a DAO, and we have maker holders, and we have the foundation itself, and we established a bunch of cultural norms about how we do things over the last year or so. Maybe it was longer, I'm not sure anymore, through the forums and the chats and these calls and through the portal itself to do decision making. As the complexity of the number of decisions or the volume of number of decisions we have to make increase, that's traditionally the time when people start talking about what does process look like, and do we need process in our organization? I'm sure lots of people on this call have been through this at various businesses in the past. And that's where MIPS came from, is an attempt to sort of formalize and clarify exactly how it is we go about doing things. I feel that we haven't quite internalized what that implies. And so we have all the things we need to do. We have a series of documents that explain how to do those things, and we need to transition from one world into the next. And so there's issues around how do we match process to our workflows, and how do we alter our workflows to match process, and how do we make sure that we all understand what's happening and when. These are larger discussions, and I'm sort of having second thoughts about whether that's a huge discussion for today. If people have thoughts about that, though, I could be convinced otherwise, and we can start talking about it now. Or potentially, this is something we could just plant a seed, and then in the next call, we can maybe start digging into it specifically with a bit of a presentation wrapped around it. I'm obviously I'm waffling like crazy right now, so I can go either way.
Cut you off. Yeah, I mean, I think like I'd be interested to kind of know how people feel about the MIPS process at this stage, I guess. How people think it's gone, if people think of it's if it's like slowing us down and causing problems, or if people thinks it's helping us in a tangible way. I guess would be interesting to know if anyone has thoughts on that, either now or whenever.
I mean, I think that if we see it as a living process, something that can be iterated on and improved as any kind of software protocol should be seen, then it's probably a positive thing as it stands. You know, the mere fact that you've been able to suggest to MIPs that A, get on Rich's nerves, and B, give us, the community, you know, some real sort of, you know, powder in, some real gunpowder is quite exciting. And that's, you know, it goes back to like ensuring that there is a consistent line of thoughts as the foundation gets toward this gradual decentralization goal. You know, they've always been clear that the idea is to gradually decentralize and ensure that there's a steady base from which to operate. And I think that the MIPs kind of provide that framework, right? And nobody thinks that they're perfect, but it'll be really, really interesting to see how easily they can be changed now. And based on that, we should, you know, begin to become more and more familiar to the point where hopefully, you know, like this governance community can begin, you know, to answer Rich's point, thinking about like, how do we actually sort of split ourselves into working groups of expertise that can address these specific pain points that have existed for a long time, and, you know, come to these kind of meetings with very, very specific and pointed kind of directives to help us improve as an overall community. That would be cool to see.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And yeah, kind of on that note, like if anybody is like has identified pain points and like has things they like want to change, and is potentially wants to write like MIPs to change them, but doesn't really feel like they understand the process well enough, or is kind of like nervous about whatever like an aspect of it, right? Like, you know, get in touch with me or Charles or like anyone, and like we can help you construct it, or if you want help, or, you know, for advice and things. So I don't feel like you have to do it all by yourself.
All right. Maybe I'm not sensing a strong outpouring of deep-seated thoughts or deep thoughts about where we're at right now. So maybe we'll formalize some of or at least frame the discussion and bring it back again in another call, or maybe it'll just develop organically over time as we begin to bite off more and more of the MIPS process and be able to get a sense of how that impacts week to week or day-to-day operations. I think that this might be a good time to wrap things up, I think, unless there's any final orders of business. Going once, going twice. All right. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. We'll be back next week with more exciting adventures of maker governance. Thanks for the presentations. Thanks for the questions. Thanks a lot for the discussion about WBTC, wherever you might be. And we'll be posting the video to YouTube soon and tweeting it to the socials. All right, thanks, everyone. Talk to you next week.